And I was dismayed and distressed at the time to hear from our members that people had phoned ambulances and ambulances refused to take people to hospital, that people had been taken to hospital and consultants had refused to admit an individual because they had come from a care home, and numerous such examples that people were being prevented as citizens from exercising their right to receive clinical care and support simply because they had come from a care home. Now, that was one piece of the guidance which we robustly hit back at and was changed by the time the guidance was reissued on the 26th of April, though sadly that practice of denying people their clinical rights should they require transfer to hospital continued.
At one point she sort of reached out to me and said, give me a hug, and she leaned really, really far forward, and I thought she was going to tip the chair up. And so I ran over to try and stop her. And the person behind the reception went absolutely nuts and was screaming at me, get your hands off her, get your hands off her.
I would like to say at this point, I have said it before, but I want it read into the record here, that I was personally very concerned about our care sector, both residential care sector and the care at home sector for adults, not all of whom were elderly, and regret very much, and will do for the rest of my life, any deaths that occurred there because of action that the Scottish Government didn't take or did take but could have done better.
When he arrived, they automatically asked him to send a DNA. When he'd phoned me to say that they'd said that to him, they'd had his temperature under control, so he was back in the room, if you like. So yeah, he did know, because it terrified him.
Right. And do you know if he was asked once or if he was asked on a number of occasions?
5 times.
5 times. 5 times that night? Or
5 times within 24 hours.
Okay. By the same person or by different
Several different people.
Several different people. And do you know, your husband told you this, so you weren't present at any of these?
No.
So your husband told you this, and could he explain why he was being, I'll use the word pressed, that's my own words, but being asked 5 times to sign the same form over a 24-hour period, and he refused on all 5 occasions?
He refused until I was present with him to make any decisions on signing anything.
Okay. Until you were present, were you ever kind of present to discuss that?
No.
I'd like to move on to the issue of DNA CPR decisions. From the end of March 2020 throughout April, you say that Age Scotland received many calls from people who said they'd been contacted out of the blue by their GP, and even in some cases by the surgery receptionist, to see if they would agree to a DNA CPR decision being put on their medical records. Were all of these people in poor health, and people for whom a DNA CPR decision, as far as you know, would have been clinically appropriate?
A lot of the conversations that our helpline had with people was because they're absolutely taken aback about why on earth are they being phoned about something now, and it's never been mentioned by their GP or the health service before. This, again, you're looking at early April, probably the height of when we sort of saw a trend. Before that, I don't think our helpline would have ever received an inquiry about a DNA CPR decision or looking for information or advice about that. I remember there was a particular example of a woman in her late 50s who was a runner, and I think her only condition was hearing loss, but was asked about it.
I've ascertained that the sedative that she was given is one called Midazolam.
That's correct.
And we've heard about Midazolam from other witnesses, and I think it is associated with end-of-life care.
She was also given 2 other drugs that were part of an end-of-life protocol.
And the other side of it was what was happening with end-of-life medication, whereby people who we had the protocols that were binary in terms of what could happen if somebody deteriorated. And if they weren't going to be actively treated and put on ventilators, then they were to be given end-of-life medication. Now, it doesn't mean that everybody in a care home with COVID ended up on end-of-life medication. And there would have been some for whom that would have been appropriate because they were going to die. But it seems that there is a bigger middle portion here than I had appreciated at first, because there are so many people who've been telling stories about their loved ones who, under other circumstances, would have been treated very differently, and who, you know, for lack of visitors, which was a big deal, did not have the support and care they normally would have had, and were being given these drugs, which are very powerful and dangerous, and which palliative care experts were calling out in May 2020, because these protocols were very explicit about how you accelerated the drug, but said nothing about winding it down. And these drugs suppress the respiratory drive. So where they have a great usage in end-of-life care when you've got cancer, it's a different story when you've got an acute respiratory infection, and the drive to breathe is incredibly important in terms of survival.
Had your mum been tested for COVID?
No.
Tell me about the testing regime at the care home.
There was no tests available, I understand, at that time. I'm personally not convinced my mum had COVID. But I'll never know that because there was no test.
His wife, however, got a phone call just before midnight on that night from a consultant at the ITU saying that Derek had been transferred into ITU, intensive care therapy unit, had been ventilated and was on maximum life support. Now, that was obviously, presumably, something that his wife then communicated to you as well.
Yes.
And obviously that, on the basis of what you've been telling us, that represented a very serious and sudden deterioration in his condition.
Yes.
Yeah.
They withdrew his medication.
Yeah. So they'd withdrawn his medication.
Yes.
And after that, there was a deterioration in his condition. Is that right?
Rapid deterioration in his condition.
Yeah.
The consultant explained that because of previous surgery, that he had a gap in his brain. The blood therefore had a space to go and did not build up, causing headaches like his first aneurysm did. The consultant told me that COVID did not kill Craig, but resulted in his death. Had he been able to assess an optician and have an examination that he normally would have done pre-COVID, he could have been saved. He would have had another operation and he would still be living today.
Hubris does not stop a pandemic. The story of COVID in Scotland is the story of the hubris